Well, welcome to episode 394 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This is a special episode. It's an interview. If you're a West Coast jazz fan, you've probably come across the name Harry Babasin. He was a multi-instrumentalist from Texas and primarily known these days for having been one of the first call bassists in that great West Coast jazz scene in Los Angeles in the early to mid-1950s, and also as a leader of the well-loved but short-lived group, the Jazz Pickers. He made a number of LPs as a leader, but he also played and recorded with a who's who roll call of great jazz stars, people like Charlie Parker, Benny Goodman, Gene Krupa, Chet Baker, Wardell Gray, Mel Torme, Barney Kessel, Bud Shank, and Dexter Gordon, just to name a few. So his recorded legacy is pretty impressive, but he's interesting to jazz historians for three other reasons. First of all, he has a very good claim to being maybe the original innovator of the cello as a jazz instrument. Secondly, he was also a significant jazz exec in the early years of West Coast jazz in LA. He founded Nocturn Records, and he also was a producer both with Nocturn and later on with Liberty Records. But perhaps his greatest claim to fame is as one of the unwitting founding fathers, or maybe founding ancestors, of the bossa nova, thanks to some wonderful work he did in the early 1950s in a quartet with Lorinda Almeida on guitar, Roy Hart on drums, and Bud Shank on sax. Now, I've been researching Harry's career because I love his music, and I'm also fascinated by those early years, the ferment of all those small labels out in LA, and that group of musicians that circulated in and amongst Hollywood and Hermosa Beach and everywhere else. I came across Vaughn Babasin, his son, on a Facebook site which focuses on jazz photos. Vaughn has been diligently archiving and curating the materials of his father's career, and while I won't spill the beans about Vaughn's broader project, I'm happy to say that he was willing to spend some time with me to talk about his dad. Now, I'm going to use some of this information on a forthcoming review I'm going to do on one of the great records his dad made with his group, the Jazz Pickers. But I thought for you music nerds out there, and in particular people who are fans of West Coast jazz, I'd post a whole interview where we talk about all the topics that I've just mentioned and much, much more. So my thanks to Vaughn, who joined me last week from his home in Sherman Oaks, California, not just for his time, but also for some of the wonderful photographs he was able to share. And I'd also like to thank Maurizio Ortolani for kindly organizing the technology for this call. Anyway, here's the interview, and I hope you enjoy it. Well, Vaughn, thank you very much for joining me this morning. How's the weather in California?
It's beautiful this morning, clear as crystal outside, and a little chill in the air, but it's really beautiful. Very nice.
Like every morning, I guess. Not so much here in Victoria. It's a little more Pacific Northwesty, let's just say that. And so liquid sunshine. So Vaughn, it's so great that you have, first of all, been spending this time really curating your dad's memory and spending some time and really, I understand, doing a lot of archival work with respect to his career. Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic thing. Could you tell me a little bit about, well, let's just start with you as Harry's son. So you're growing up with him. What was life like with Harry?
Well, he's an unusual cat. He was really a very nice man, and he was a good friend to all of his musician buddies. He used to hang out down at Drum City, which was a major thoroughfare through the 40s and 50s. It was started by Remo Belli, the famous Remo drumheads, and Roy Hart, and they got together, and Remo would basically make these plastic drumheads and give them to Roy, and Roy would take them out on a gig and test them, and they eventually ended up fashioning the first plastic drumheads. But yeah, Drum City was just a central hub down on Santa Monica Boulevard, right around the corner from the Musicians Union on Vine. And my brother and I used to go down there and just kind of hang out. And, we'd see people like Herb Ellis and Jimmy Weibel come up to just kind of hang out. And they were doing a duet gig around town. So they'd do a little practice, like a personal private concert right there in front of us, and just see some of the most amazing musicians in life.
Was that where he met Roy Hart at Drum City, or before?
Oh, they actually ran into each other at some of the earliest bands that Dad was in back in '44. They hooked up. They were playing with Johnny Richards, and they also joined Billy Rogers. She was a female trumpeter that gained some fame with Woody Herman, and just before the war ended, she had some moderate success with the band she put together, And that's where Roy and Harry first met. They started to actually play together. They recorded on Musiccraft with Billy. That was like the third or fourth recording in my dad's career. But yeah, it was the first time that Roy and Harry met, and they stayed together for their entire lives. They were partners from that point on.
And we'll come back to Roy Hart's role in your dad's life in a bit. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about Harry's early years. Now, he was born in Texas. Yeah, could you talk us
Yes, sir.
through a little bit of his early life?
Yeah, well, his father was a dentist. He escaped the Armenian genocide in 1909 and came over. He had a cousin, Vahan Simon Babasinian, who was at the University of Iowa. And so that's where he went to school, and he got his PhD in dentistry and ended up going down to the Vernon area in Texas, in northern rural Texas, and settled there and became a respected dentist in the area. So he met my grandmother, and they married, and they had Harry in a hospital in Dallas because my grandmother wanted to have Harry in a big city hospital.
Modern times.
But interestingly enough, they were so prominent. To this day, the house on Yamparica Street down in Vernon is still known as the Babasin House.
Now, was that anglicized a little bit? Well, you
Yes.
said Babasinian before, so
Right.
it was shortened, was it?
Right.
At Ellis Island or somewhere like that, I suppose?
Well, he signed in Ellis Island as Babasinian, but I'm not sure exactly when he decided to transition. But there was a funny little family story about him on a train traveling south, and he went through Chicago, and there was, at this one stop, there was a Shriners convention. So the place was full of guys with fezzes on, and he thought the Turkish army had come to get him and drag him back to Armenia. And so I think pretty much at that time he decided to Americanize everything. He became Yervant Harry Babasin, and he actually went by Doc popularly in Vernon. So everybody referred to him as Doc, and then Harry was born. He named him Yervant Harry Babasin Jr., so he had Americanized that, and then my father chose to just go by the middle name, Harry. And so...
And were Harry's parents, were your grandparents musical?
Yes, both of them were. My grandmother was a music teacher, and she sang in choirs, and she was quite the grande dame of Vernon, if you can even say that.
No, I can imagine.
But they were fairly well off, and they would travel. She always religiously went to Central City, Colorado, for the opening of the opera season there. Dad talks a lot about seeing all kinds of music, being influenced by just amazing people throughout his early youth. And then kind of graduated up to, he mentions the 1935 Goodman Palomar concert that kind of launched swing, and being influenced by that, and Jay McShann, who had Charlie Parker, and that just blew him away. That was really the kind of jazz he wanted to play. Yeah.
What about your grandfather?
My grandfather, they said he could have been a professional cellist. But I think dentistry seemed to be the more stable occupation, at least in his eyes.
It's funny, just a sidebar. I recently did a label guide to Atlantic Records, and dentistry is a common theme that flows all the way through the early years of Atlantic Records. From one of the partners was a trainee dentist, and they also got all their funding from another dentist. So there's some kind of jazz dentistry link there. So obviously there were string instruments, there was a cello and so on, and I guess maybe a string bass in the house. Who knows? When Harry was growing up, how did that work out?
Very probably. He was just musical all his life. So he could play. They say he could play anything. His teachers called him a prodigy. And from what I understand, he actually was offered a scholarship for bassoon. Either way, yeah. But he chose to turn that down because he could make more money playing bass. And, so that's really...
Did he play piano as well?
He wrote on piano. He wasn't really a performance level pianist, but he definitely wrote his music on a piano. We always had a piano out in our garage, and that's where he hung out at home a lot of times.
And I imagine your grandparents probably had a piano in the house, and that have been some of his first musical
Yes,
learning would have been on a piano. Yeah.
definitely.
Okay.
Yeah,
Interesting. So keyboards, wind instruments, and stringed instruments. So that's really quite something. Tells you something about his facility, doesn't it?
definitely. Yeah, he actually mentions that he taught himself to read concert clef, every clef, so he could. He said he was a band leader's dream. When he hit New York, all the band leaders learned who he was, and he could read fluently, and he could transpose in his head while reading. So he was ideal for any singer that wanted to change a key of a song that, and because I sing it in this key, of course. he mentions that too, the frustration with singers, vocalists that always seem to need to play it in another key.
Well, I mean, that's the trick of session guys, wasn't it? That ability to sight read and to adjust and be flexible. Yeah.
Correct.
So,
yeah.
So what about his formal musical education? Was it all at home, or did he train at school or with other teachers?
Yeah, he trained at school. He first started to go to Texas A&M. I think he only attended for a semester because he had flat feet and asthma. So they drummed him out of there. But he mentions playing in the marching band at the time. And he talks about how unusual. There was one professor who had invented the idea of mixing up the instruments so you could more evenly balance the sounds of the instruments blending together, rather than having all the horns, all the tubas, segregated apart from one another. He blended them together, and he thought that was really pretty amazing. But he was a tuba player in the marching band. Of course, right. A lot of bass players play tuba.
Yeah, they do. That's right. And of course, the tuba was the precursor to the bass in terms of its role in jazz. What was so was music his major at college?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Was he playing in bands at the time, or what about how his college musical life?
When he left A&M, he said the most instrumental decision they made was for him to go to UNT, which was called North Texas State Teachers College at that time. And they were just really starting to get their reputation for jazz. So he went to school with Jimmy Giuffre and Herb Ellis were his good friends, Tommy Reeves, Gene Roland. There was a good number of strong jazz people that were there at the time. And this was even before the 1 O'Clock Band started their history. But these guys kind of laid the groundwork for much of what was to come.
Wow. And so obviously he's training formally at university, but he's also gigging with these guys regularly. Did they have a regular group then?
Yeah. At that time, while he was in school, I have a picture of him playing with Giuffre in the Bill Ware Orchestra. And he was like just a local Texas band that kind of played social events and cotillions and that kind of stuff. And so... that's probably the youngest picture of him that I have him playing.
Wow, and they both got to be, 19 or 20, something like
exactly, that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's fascinating. I'd love to see that picture at one point.
Sure, I'll have to send that to you. Definitely.
That would be great if you could.
Sure, of course.
I'd love to show that. Thank you, Vaughn.
Definitely.
And so at this point in university, is he focusing principally on the bass? Have the wind instruments and the reeds, are they still around, or?
Well, he broadly studied music in all aspects. Unfortunately, he was a little bit of a know-it-all. It wasn't real popular with some of his professors, just because you couldn't teach Harry anything, unfortunately.
Right.
And he formally never got a degree, although you will read many different stories throughout the years about him graduating with a degree from UNT, but he really didn't. He ended up back in the late 50s, early 60s. He went back to school at CSUN, Northridge, which was San Fernando Valley State College back then, and he studied under Aurelio de la Vega and received his bachelor's and went on to get his master's at that school.
Right.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there's no shame in all that, obviously. Miles Davis never finished at Juilliard, did he? And look what happened to him. So,
That's right.
Oh, and of course, I mean actually that's quite a typical story, because a lot of the people which I have researched and chatted about on this channel are people who are taking a music degree and then their career takes off. And the whole point of the degree was to have a music career. So off they go, you know. So can you tell me then, Vaughn, about the beginnings of Harry's musical career,
Well, sure.
professional career?
The little quip, the story that I told you last time, he and Herb Ellis had gone to see an orchestra, the Charlie Fisk Orchestra. And so Dad, being a brash young bass player that he was, went up to Charlie and said that Herb and he could outplay his rhythm section. And so he proceeded to show him, and Charlie hired them right on the spot. And
Wow.
yeah, and then they left school at that time, not completing their degrees.
So they just hit the road.
They just hit the road.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what they really wanted to do. You know, and there was a little controversy in my family history there too.
I can imagine. I was going to ask what that was like for mom and dad.
The dentist in my grandfather was like, "Oh, I don't want you playing music," but that was Harry's love, and by the time he made it into Goodman's band, all was corrected, all was okay, because obviously Goodman was the biggest name at the time, and Dad was Goodman's bass player, so.
So he was traveling with Charlie Fisk, and this would be what, is this the early 40s?
42, yeah, 42.
42.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And because of the asthma and the flat feet, he wasn't in danger of any military service, I guess.
Correct.
That was okay. So and that of course opens up a lot of possibility for a young musician, because a lot of musicians had been drafted.
Correct.
And so he was able, I guess, to find work with different orchestras. How did that all play out at that time?
Yeah, things with those smaller name orchestras, they would all of a sudden be left in a town with no work, and all of a sudden they're scrambling. I think with the Charlie Fisk, when that ended, he actually went home for a bit. And then I have this really interesting little Western Union telegram that was sent to him by Jimmy Joy, saying that an opening had opened up, and you're welcome to join us at your first juxtaposition, or I'm not sure how he put it, but it was pretty cool. But so he joined the Jimmy Joy Orchestra and toured around.
So eventually, though, he ends up in New York, yeah?
Eventually he does, yeah. After Jimmy Joy, he hooked up with Bob Strong Orchestra, and Bob was headed to New York, and that's really where Harry he needed to go. Now, I will say through this, with the Charlie Fisk, when they took off, they went to Kansas City, and my dad first met Bird at that time, and before he was called Bird, as he says in his memoirs, and he was playing at an after-hours roadhouse that served corn squeezins.
I wonder if that was when he was with Billy Eckstine's band, Bird.
Boy,
Could have been, maybe.
I'm not sure. It's possible.
Around that time, maybe. Okay, so he ends up in New York. And what's his first foothold in the Big Apple?
Well, first thing he does, he records with Bob Strong. And just kind of through osmosis, he ends up recording with Clyde Lucas as well. So there were like 4 albums that were released on Hit Records, all recorded in sequence in March of 44. And that was his first professional recording in the studio with an orchestra.
And that would have been just after the recording van, I guess.
Yeah, so those were the first 2 guys that he recorded with, were Clyde Lucas and Bob Strong. And from there, he ended up going to the Billy Rogers Orchestra. And then they did recordings. That's cool, because Musicraft, a lot of those labels in the old days, they would actually list all the players on the label itself, which is so cool. So that's the first professional recording that actually lists him as a bass player, and Roy Hart's on that too. So it's really
right there
on the label. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. And that's okay. And so that's where he bumps into Roy Hart, is with
Billy Rogers. Yes.
Billy Rogers.
Yeah.
Okay. And so how long does he stay with Billy Rogers?
So he about, 6 months to a year. And that's when he's really starting to gain traction in New York. And so his next one is Gene Krupa. And so that's his first big name. And I've got a metronome from 1945 that is a review of a live performance by Krupa's band. And he mentions that Krupa has discovered this new bassist, Harry Babasin, Babison. But that's okay. It was Gene Krupa discovered him, so that was pretty awesome. Even though he had already established himself with these lesser known bands, obviously, this was the first big name that really cracked through.
And it's an interesting time to be a bassist because Jimmy Blanton had kind of revolutionized the instrument with Ellington, and so now I guess your dad's got maybe is Krupa giving him more room to solo and do different things in the band? Or
well, I don't think so. He wasn't with them all that long. He did do a couple of recordings on Columbia, but he's just, I don't know. He was just bouncing around all over the place. He hooked up with Charlie Barnett, which was another one that was very significant because Charlie became his good friend throughout. Again, much like Roy, of course, Roy, they were really business partners and were in it together that way. But Charlie, they just became great friends and played on and off together. Charlie was responsible for bringing Dad out to the West Coast, the Ocean Park Casino gig. There's even that Stars of Jazz episode that the Jazz Pickers is featured on. Charlie is on that episode, and he's introduced as Harry's manager. And they talk about a tour they're going to start at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. And Bobby Troop and Charlie Barnett are talking.
And there's the LA connection. But we've missed a big name in this conversation, which is Benny Goodman.
Oh, yeah. Well, Benny really was more on the West Coast because it was really, for all of 46, Dad was playing with Boyd Rayburn's orchestra. And that was very significant. Boy, that was a very unique, very avant-garde big band to play with. But he met Joe Marmarosa and Jackie Mills, who they, later on did the first cello recordings in jazz. That was pretty much all of 46 was with Rayburn. And then he started...
Still in New York?
No, this is on the West Coast now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He came out here, it was around between 45, 46 is when they came out here. And
this was Charlie Barnett was touring and he just came along and then stayed? Is that how it went?
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. And
was he married then?
No, it just was so much work. There was music, studio, film work, there was so much stuff happening here and plus he talks about his warm Texas blood didn't agree with New York's weather. So he was really much happier to come to the West Coast and, decide to settle down at that point in time.
In Los Angeles?
In Los Angeles, yes, sir. Yeah, because he hooked up with Goodman and they did the movie A Song Is Born. So he was really riding the tide at that time. All the newspapers back in Texas are all Harry Babasin starring in A Song Is Born. Of course, he didn't have a line in the movie, but still, the hometown hero makes big. So that was pretty significant news back home.
So tell us about that movie.
Well, that was pretty much the launching pad. Like I said, that legitimized his musical career to my grandfather, which was really very cool. Because, again, he's with one of the biggest names in music at that time. And then this movie came up, which the working title was That's Life. I still have his contract for $300 a week. And he was doing so well at that time, he purchased a house, a 4-level house in the heart of the Hollywood Hills. Oh, I'm just amazing. Right you could walk out to a terrace on the side of the living room and see the Hollywood sign. It was on a little road called Tuxedo Terrace, and just an amazing house. Unfortunately, when all the bad stuff happened to him around 56 and the bankruptcy and all that, he had to sell the house. At the same time, my grandfather had passed away that same year. And so my grandmother ended up selling the house in Vernon, Texas, and buying the house from my dad So that was still the house that I went to go visit Grandma all my life. But he ended up buying a little tract house in Pacoima in the San Fernando Valley for $10,000.
Is the house still there, Bon?
Uh, yeah, it's still there. I'm not sure. Gosh, yeah, I haven't visited Google Earth in quite some time, so I haven't really seen what shape it's in. But it was a 4-level house. The top level was street level, and then you went downstairs, and there was a terrace and a complete apartment that he would let friends, musician friends. In fact, when Jimmy Jufrey, when he brought Jimmy out from Vernon the first time, he moved into that little apartment and to just to get a foothold. And that he did that for a lot of people, and a lot like musicians that were in bad shape and needed to dry out. Sometimes, and then Dad would kind of be the guy that would take them in for a little bit so they could clean up their act.
Can we just do a little? I don't want to pry too deeply into that, but I mean, as we all know, let's just say there were refueling issues associated to the jazz scene and other challenges that people had. Your dad managed to stay clear of all that, it seems like.
Pretty much. There is a famous arrest at that house in Hollywood for marijuana possession in 1947. It was kind of the beginning of the whole McCarthy era at that time, that they were really looking for high-profile entertainment people in Hollywood that were connected to drugs, and that was it was just the beginning of that era. 47, 50s was when McCarthy really came into power, but
because of the well-established connection between cannabis and socialism.
Yeah, of course.
So,
but
yeah, fair enough.
Thank God that was as far as he went. He drank booze and he smoked some pot, but that was pretty much what he did.
Just adds to his credibility, really, in the jazz world, doesn't it? So, okay, well, thank you for noting that. Okay, so he's picking up some work there. He's working with Charlie Barnett and others. He's got some spending money. He's got himself a nice house. I'm assuming there's a girlfriend, maybe a wife on the horizon at this point.
Well, yeah, more or less. I mean, I don't know. He doesn't really talk about his dating scene so much. But in 1950, well, okay, he does the, gosh, there's so many things that happen. His last final big tour is in 48 when the recording band takes place. And he hooks up with Woody Herman's Second Herd, which he calls his dream band, because it's got all his buddies, Zoot Sims and Shorty Rogers, and some of his closest pals are in this band, and he just can't turn it down. So
it's a great band.
Yeah, it was really amazing, yeah. But he also found out that by the time he got to New York, he just wasn't making the kind of money to sustain his life and his mortgage and everything the way he could out in L.A., because you can, you work gigs, you work with bands, you work in the studios. He had so many different sources of funds that being on tour really wasn't functional anymore. So he ended up returning to L.A., and when he did that, he hooked up with Frank Duvall's orchestra, was playing for the Jack Smith radio show, and that was probably the next 3 years of his life from 49, 50, 51. And so they played out of the KHJ studios in Burbank. And my mom was a receptionist at KHJ, and she was kind of a model as well. She worked on, I have some great pictures of her working on Queen for a Day with Jack Bailey. And she's kind of the Vanna White of Queen for a Day. So that was pretty cool. But they met, and literally in 2 weeks, they eloped to Las Vegas and got married.
Wow.
And we're together for the rest of their lives,
Wow. Well, that's just fantastic. So yeah, so he's this young, charismatic guy who's playing music. He's got this beautiful young wife and all the rest of it. Now, this is where I think, is this not where Roy Hart comes back into the picture regarding Nocturn Records? But before we jump into that, can you just tell me a little bit about, to the extent that you're aware of, of that developing West Coast scene and the move from the bigger bands into some of the small group work that they were doing?
Right. Yeah. Well, they were, everybody kind of used their own band to get here kind of thing. I'm not sure. I think it was Kenton that Roy was with. I can't swear to that, but he came,
I think you
you
might be
know,
right.
and they hooked up down here, and they started doing, the jam sessions were a very important part of jazz always. So Dad's playing with Barney Kessel at the Elks Club concert, and then they go to Santa Monica Civic and they're playing the Just Jazz concerts, and they're hooking up with some of the most amazing Wardell Gray, Dexter Gordon, so some of the most amazing West Coasters.
Did he also stop by the lighthouse, I guess, in Hermosa Beach?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I have a recording of him with Art Pepper and the Sonny Clark Trio. But again, see, Dad's playing the cello in that one. Now that was something that happened from the movie. We didn't really get into that movie. We kind of wandered away from it. But the movie was so significant to him because it just opened up these doors. The cello was a prop cello that was sitting around on the set, and he put it up on his lap and started plucking on it. And Charlie Barnett came over and said, "Hey, Harry, that's if you develop that, that's really something." And sure enough, he went out to buy the cello, and the cello, not only did it provide him with the ability to be a lead instrument, because bass is so often slightly regarded because it's just holding down the bottom and just provides the basis, and a lot of times soloing it's hard for people to really grasp what's happening on a bass because of the low register and everything. The cello was right there with the guitar, and he could add that. He could go to a club and pull his cello out of his car and go on up to the bandstand and jam with the guys.
I'm intrigued by the physicality of it. So obviously with the bass, it's standing on the ground, and you're playing it. Is with the cello, would he sit it on top of a box or a chair, or physically how would he play or would he sit down with it like a classic cello player?
Yeah, well, sometimes it varied. Like in the Stars of Jazz show, he's had a long peg on the bottom, a very long peg, and he's sitting down with it in between his legs and just plucking away on it. Yeah, it just kind of depended on the situation, but he also altered the headstock. So it would tune in fourths like a bass instead of the traditional classical tuning in fifths of a traditional cello. So it really was a bastard bass, bastard cello. Now you have Stanley Clark, I think, says that he invented the piccolo bass. Well, the piccolo bass is a cello, really, just tuned down or an octave above. So. It's just funny. That kind of stuff is very funny.
Every invention in jazz has 15 innovators, right? So when we chatted before, Vaughn, and I'm hoping we could chat about this again now. So your dad's getting into, obviously, he's getting lots of work playing. He's getting into that whole scene with the smaller groups, and there's some recording work happening here too. We talked a bit about, for instance, recording for Pacific for Dick Bach and his connection with Lorinda Almeida. I wonder if you could tell us about that story.
Sure. Well, there again is another birth from the movie A Song is Born. Lorinda was a part of a group that they called the Brazilians. He didn't even have his name in the credits. He was just an extra. And they met on the set of the movie. And to pass the time, Lorinda would play these Brazilian folk tunes that he's been playing all his life to kind of just pass the time. And Harry decided he'd pick up a bass and start accompanying him. And except what Harry did was, instead of the traditional whole note, half note, 1-4-5 bass lines that were, if you can even call them bass lines, they were just really notes to hold down the bottom. He started syncopating. He started bopping the bass line, and that just opened up worlds to Lorenzo. He couldn't believe it. Was like, oh my gosh, there's a melody happening in the bass. And that really was the precursor to what we call the bossa nova now. They fell apart for a while after the movie broke up, but somewhere in the 51, I believe it was, Dad did a sit-in gig. He had to sub for somebody, and Lorenzo happened to be playing. And so they reestablished their connection again and started working toward really putting together something here. They were working, I guess, practicing at a side room in Drum City, and Bud Shank came in. Supposedly, this is Roy's famous story. Bud Shank came in and he had a gig, so he said, "Where can I warm up my reed?" And Roy said, "Go into that room back there." And that, of course, that's where Harry and Laurendo were, and the rest is history. They actually formed a quartet at that point, and they played live, a few gigs live at The Hague, and that's where Dick Bach heard them live. And he insisted on recording them, which was kind of funny because Laurendo, Dad was really the impetus behind all that. It really was him who spurred this on. Laurendo had a vision of being a classical guitarist. That's really what he was. And in a sense, he was uncomfortable with the freedom, the open freedom of jazz. Roy was always saying, "Well, we always wanted to see if Laurendo could swing." And he said that over and over about 1,000,000 times. And what happened was, after they recorded the second 10-inch album for Pacific Jazz, Laurendo left the group and signed an exclusive contract with Capitol Records at that time to record classical guitar. And he won awards, Grammys. I mean, it was definitely where he wanted to go, but it devastated the group. The rest of the group was like, well, how do you easily replace a virtuoso Brazilian guitar player? You don't.
Yeah. Before Brazilian music was cool, 10 years before.
Exactly.
And the story of what happens to those records is incredible.
Yeah, Laurendo took boxes of the albums down to Brazil with him and passed it out all his friends. He said by the time he went back, they had worn the grooves all the way through the album. They had played it so much. And
his friends being people like whom?
Like Joe Beam and the classic, the bossa nova guys that you always hear about.
And famously, that also happened to I guess it was Bud Shank, who didn't realize that Laurendo had taken those records and distributed them.
Right.
So I gather.
Right. And
then he goes down there on tour 10 years later to find that everyone's got his records, and it's like searching for Sugar Man, and it's such a remarkable story but so wonderful that your dad was part of that, and without which we wouldn't have some of the most amazing music of the 1960s, right? All from that inspiration.
From that, yeah, definitely.
That's amazing. Can you tell us a bit about your dad's forays into owning a record label?
Okay, well, again, we're at the birth of Pacific Jazz, 1952. Oh, it's also, I wanted to say that Dad's hosting a jam session in Inglewood at a club called the Trade Winds, where he invited many, many of his friends to play there. And famously, Chet Baker's first career professional recording is at one of these jam sessions in March of 52. And then later on in June, Chet meets Bird for the first time, and they play, and it's recorded, and it's been released by Fresh Sound now, remastered as Bird and Chet live from the Trade Winds. That's just, recorded for posterity. So that was pretty important at that time. But also in 52, Roy and Harry and Dick Bach, they're hanging out with Dick, and Dick wants to get a record label started, and Roy supposedly loans $200 to Dick Bach to get the label off the ground. And the first two albums are from Jerry Mulligan, recorded at Phil Turetsky's house. Not even at a studio. And we're not sure, I'm pretty sure that's where the third album was recorded, but they did a Harry Babasin trio album on Pacific Jazz, number 603. So he was the third album that was produced by Pacific Jazz. But at that time, that's when Harry and Roy looked at each other and said, you know what? We could do this, which actually made some enemies, unfortunately. I think he kind of strained his relationship with Dick Bach at that time because, Dick pretty much was the producer. And a lot of times record producers get uppity when musicians think they can do the same thing, so, and everybody gets very protective about their roles in whatever it is. So,
plus it's all about connections too, because there, at that time, there's probably 30 or 40 guys circling amongst all these groups, right? They're cutting records, but it's not a huge pool, so Dick wants to hold on to his talent and all the rest of it. And if Harry and Roy, who are well-connected guys, probably better connected in the music scene than Dick in some respects, do their own thing, you can see why it's threatening for Dick, I would imagine. Yeah. So they form their own label.
Yep, Nocturn Records. And they decide to feature their buddies, the people that were, as he said, hidden in the commercial work of the city, though they are strong musicians of their own right, So Herbie Harper got his first shot at being a leader. Bud Shank's first album as a leader was on Nocturne and LP2. And then Harry had his own quintet, and Bobby Nvolson got his shot. Some great Western. I have to mention, too, while estranging Dick Bach and other producers, per se, he was also estranging some musicians, because all his buddies wanted to be recorded. They wanted their own groups, but Harry, as most musicians, they have they're discerning in their own musical tastes as well. So some musicians he didn't quite like as much as the others. And so he didn't necessarily want to give them a shot at leading their own bands. And so he got some hard feelings on that respect as well. And Nocturne was a very interesting animal anyway, because it was kind of a co-op label. It was built he called it a co-op label. And that meant that if you were unhappy with Nocturne, the way they were promoting your album, he would just let you walk with your master and go sell it somewhere else or whatever. So there were two prominent albums within the original Nocturne releases. Number 4 was Conley Graves, pianist Conley Graves. He walked. And actually, a lot of those tracks ended up on a 12-inch Liberty album that was part of the Jazz in Hollywood Liberty series that Dad started producing but then was fired from. But anyway, Conley Graves was number 4, and then number 5 was Earl Father Hines. And that was the first album that Nocturne released that got a bad review, got about a 2-star review, and Earl wasn't happy with that. And he was promoting the heck out of it. I've got some really cool ads that were being run for that album. But Earl was still very unhappy, and so he took that master and left. So when you'll see compilations of Nocturne's releases now, you won't see the Conley Graves or the Earl Father Hines in those sets because they left.
Interesting. I think I was just reading the other day that Indian Navigation, a label out of New York, had the same practice years later, where they would give the masters to the musicians, which probably explains why not a lot of the masters are around, because they're in musicians' basements or got sold or who knows what, But just to continue the arc of Nocturne. So Nocturne's not around forever. How many records did Nocturne put out?
Well, they actually officially released 8, but they had, oh my gosh, I have a double 10-inch album that's called Bobby and the Troop, Troop. And it's a double album, 10-inch album, that they were getting ready to release on Nocturne before they just ran out of money.
So it's like a test pressing or something?
And yeah, it's a test pressing. It's very cool. I can show you that as well. I'll send you pictures of the labels.
Wow,
and what ended up happening was Liberty. See, Nocturne then merged with Liberty because of their financial woes, and he was hired. Dad was hired as the producer of the Jazz in Hollywood series for Liberty. That's the LJH series. But he also did some more pop albums, which were in the LRP series, which is where this Bobby Troop album ended up going. The double 10-inch, they ended up, there were 16 tracks on the two 10-inch albums, they took 4 of those tracks away and then released 12 of them on this one 12-inch album that's now called Bobby Troup and His Trio. And it's a 12-inch album in the LRP series of Liberty's releases. So
is that the same test pressing that you had, but it's now been released by
Yes.
Liberty as a full?
Right.
Okay, gotcha.
Except 4 of the tracks were never released. Those, that's I'm the only person in the world that has those 4 tracks on vinyl.
Oh, you should,
I don't even have.
You should needle drop them and put them on YouTube at some point. But love to hear
perhaps.
those. That's very cool. So this is around what, 54?
So this is 54 going into 55. Really, the merger happened in early 55, and that's when they re-released some of the Nocturne stuff remastered on Liberty albums. So Herbie Harper, there were 2 albums by Herbie Harper on Nocturne, and they combined those into a single 12-inch album, and so that was released. And then Steve White did an album. Jack Millman with Buddy Collette. They did about 4 or 5 on the the LJH series, and the same thing over with the LRP series, which then was coming up to the Julie London release. And apparently what happened was the exec, Cy Warnaker at Liberty, heard Julie and said, this is a hit, and we want full control. So they fired Harry. And they gave, of all things, they gave the producer credit to Bobby Troup, who then married Julie London later on, of course. So that was a really bad situation. That led to my dad having to declare bankruptcy, and he was kind of blackballed from producing at that point too.
Now, Mode Records is now coming into being at this point, and if I recall correctly, I think Mode was. Did Red Clyde not start Mode? I think whoever had been the Bethlehem West Coast sort of footprint guy had eventually decided to go and start Mode. Long story short, anyway, that's the label on which Harry ends up putting out the Jazz Pickers record.
Well, the first ones are actually Mercury MRC. Bob Shad from Mercury really liked the Jazz Pickers. So the first Jazz Picker album that was officially released is the For Moderns Only. That's that one up there. Buddy Collette, Bill Douglas, Bob Harrington. But that was the actual first Jazz Picker release. And they followed that up with a second one called Command Performance that featured Red Norvo on vibes. So then the Mode album came after those 2 and was then still considered to be the best of Harry Babasin, and that one featured Terry Gibbs, as you well know. And
right, and that's where he's really. I mean, at this point, he's now been doing the cello tangent, if you want to call it that, for quite some time. I guess 7 or 8 years at this point. So tell me about. Tell me about that. How central was the cello to his playing at that point? Was it most of the time? Was he playing cello?
It was back and forth, definitely. Now, going back all the way back to Woody Herman tour, when he went to New York, he states in his memoirs that he met up with Oscar Pettiford, who was his idol, and he shared with him all that he knew of cello. And that was in 48, which the first tracks that he had recorded were back in 47 with Dona Marmarosa. But 2 years later, after they had hooked up, then Oscar comes out with the cello and makes quite the stink with it. That's kind of why Harry was the massive defender of West Coast, because he did the cello, and he legitimately did the cello. It wasn't like rudimentary cello. It was amazing. You listen to those tracks with Dodo, and he's ripping that baby up, and he's filling the role of the bass, but then he's being able to solo as well and go back and forth as a supporting instrument, but also as a solo instrument. So he wanted to continue to develop that. And then I have to mention, very significant recording in 53, Oscar Pettiford came out to the West Coast, and they hooked up and they put together a band of two cellos, duet cellos, and all Harry's writing. Harry decided he needed to write the book for cello because there really was no cello for jazz written. So he had a good dozen or so tunes that he wrote, and they arranged and played as duet at the Hague, again at the Hague. They ended up, they actually recorded for Pacific Jazz, but for some reason Dick Bach ended up selling the master to Imperial Records, and Imperial put the record out.
And what was it called when Imperial put it out?
The Oscar Pettifer All Stars.
Okay, that's that record.
That's that little EP. Yes, It's got Blues in the Closet. I think that may be the first recording of Blues in the Closet, and it's
interesting.
It's duet back and forth between Harry and Oscar. It's incredible, absolutely incredible.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting story. I hadn't heard that particular story of that particular record before. Now, Fred Katz was also playing jazz cello with Chico's band.
Chico. This is after Harry left. I kind of have my own little opinion that Dick kind of was angry, that these guys left, and I think he really did like the whole cello thing. So I think Chico had recorded as a trio for Pacific Jazz before they added Fred Katz, and this was kind of like Dick Bach, I think, wanted to kind of get back at Harry and bring a cello into a group. But the significant difference, and I spoke to Fred Katz myself, he was very proud of the fact that he only played arco. He did not pizzicato his cello. So it was only arco. And then Dad never arcoed the cello. He was always pizzicato. So
yeah, and the stylistic differences too. I mean, you'd never accuse your dad of being a chamber jazz guy, right?
And
so, but that Chico band was very much chamber jazz for a while.
Yeah, but believe it or not, many reviews talk about jazz chamber music, that the cello, the jazz pickers were, they were more subtle. There was a much more subtle sound. But
to me, it still swings a lot harder than the other stuff.
No doubt about it, for sure. And I've got there's another really cool recording. It was done. It's called The Navy Swings. And it was a Navy recruitment tape that was recorded, and it's narrated by George Fenneman from You Bet Your Life, and Charlie Barnett and Jerry Southern are the featured artists. And so George comes on and says, "Hey, this Navy is really fast-paced, and just like this Charlie Barnett song." And Charlie, "Oh, okay, guys, well, we're going to play a really cool hit song right now." And it was the entire Jazz Picker playbook. They played all of Harry's originals, and
wow.
It blew me away. But it has horns on it. It's the only time I've ever heard Jazz Picker tunes with horns on them, and they're really
interesting, really
incredible.
How many compositions did your dad come up with over the course of his career, do you think? It's rough guess.
Not a whole lot. I'd probably think about 40 or 50. And I'm also referring to stuff that he did. Well, gosh, he played. I've got cassette tapes that were never made it to a vinyl or any kind of an actual recording, but they would constantly record music down at Drum City. They had there was a building on the premises called Clover Recordings, which was very famous. Michael Jackson did some recording there. I got a picture of Tom Petty at the control board. There were some very famous people that worked that used that recording studio. And Dad and Roy would accept, instead of payment, they would get recording time. And so whoever happened to be there, John Bannister, Jimmy Weibel, Bill Hood, whoever happened to be there, they would just go record stuff. And a lot of that stuff did make it to albums under the Jazz Chronicles series, which is, of course, in the late 70s, 80s. That was much later in his life.
I was going to ask you, so, I mean, the 50s really are the great time for that West Coast.
Yes, yeah.
Certainly for, I mean, I think for black musicians, one would put that phase earlier, because as the white musicians came in, the black musicians found they had less opportunity. But for the white players, the 50s were the greatest time, and things kind of dry up as we get into the turn of the decade. latter half of the 50s then, how is your dad spending his time? He's cutting some music. He's not playing with bigger bands now. He's basically gigging in small groups.
Yeah, pretty much. He did, again, he went back to school in the early 60s to try to maybe do some teaching gigs. I think he taught at LA City College for a little while. But that didn't really ever pan out. He just didn't really have the temperament for students. I don't know. It's
Nice.
It isn't.
Not everybody does.
Not everybody does. That's correct.
Personal experience. So tell me about his career in the 60s then.
Okay.
Because at that point, it's tougher to be sort of what you might call a productive recording musician, isn't it? You've got to be doing other stuff in LA, I guess. Is that true?
He had a regular gig at the Statler Hilton. And it was either Charlie Barnett or Skinny Ennis, those two orchestras. And he played almost every week. He was, we'd be sitting down to dinner and he'd be, Mom would be ironing his shirt and, and out of dinner, he'd be getting his suit on and going to work.
So you must have seen some of those gigs.
Some of them, yeah. I mean, the 60s, I'm still pretty young. I was born in 55, So I didn't really start until I was a teenager before I saw him play with the Dixieland Band. Bob Crosby was playing at Disneyland. And so I got to see him go play there. And then he did a big tour in 71, 72 called the Big Band Cavalcade that featured Frankie Carl, Freddie Martin, Margaret Whiting, and Bob Crosby, and they toured the nation. That was the last big tour he did in his career. And
was he still picking up sideman work or studio work in the 60s?
Few and far between. It was. I really don't know why he fell from grace. Again, there was the whole blackballing with Liberty that kind of put a sour taste in everybody's mouth. And he did, out of those ashes, he did the Jazz Pickers. The Jazz Pickers came out of all that terribleness, and so that was a significant time in his life because, again, All Music Guide still calls that album we're talking about, the Terry Gibbs one, as the best of Harry Babasin. So
yeah, his creative peak.
Exactly,
yeah, I think that'd be the consensus peak. But that's not. A lot of people struggled in the 60s in LA trying to play jazz. It's not something one would say he should necessarily take personally, I would think.
Oh yeah, no, it wasn't personal. It was just what happened, And so that's why they would hang out at Drum City and try and record and keep doing what they could. They also bought the first Sony digital recording device, which recorded to 2-inch videotape, and they called it Live on Tape. And they had purchased it. I think they got a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, and they purchased this machine. It had 6 towers. You think of our computers nowadays. Had 6-foot towers that had to go into another room. They made so much noise. They had to be separated into another room, and a hole for all the wires had to go out because of the noise that those things made. But ironically, it turns out that the digital recordings are far worse than the analog could ever be. After time, the digital, when they break, they shatter. And when you lose digital information, it's gone. There's no way to retrieve it at all. Whereas... Was
this with Roy?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, by now, Roy and him, they're just like, when Schwarzenegger and DeVito did Twins, Dad would, hey, we were the original Twins, because Dad's 6'1" and Roy's 4'2". They were quite the team.
So your dad and Roy are coming up with schemes, and their wives are rolling their eyes.
Oh, yes, sir. You got that right. Yeah. And they're hanging out with everybody. Jack Sheldon's there. Leroy Vinegar's there. Just everybody in the city hangs out at Drum City. It was really a central hub. The 60s is when the Pro Drum Shop opened up across the street from the local 47. And that kind of took over, the more contemporary drummers started going there. And so the older Drum City started to kind of fall by the wayside a little bit. But their heyday was definitely the 50s. They were just like, everybody went there. Red Fox, Scatman Crothers, Harrison Ford, just all kinds of different stars.
And there were all those jazz clubs around there too, like Jazz City and all those clubs
sure.
that kind of were nearby there. Yeah. But when your dad talks about, the heyday, when he talked about the heyday of jazz in LA in the 40s and 50s, I guess 50s really would have been his principal experience. So how would he talk about it? How did he describe it?
Well, he was in love with it. I mean, he got to hang out with all his buddies, the people that he most admired were the guys that he could call on the phone and say, let's play. And they would, boom, they'd be together and they'd be playing,
And he played with a lot of people.
Oh my gosh.
Even just his side, how many records is he a sideman on? Are you aware of that?
He had an article, an interview in an International Musician that he said he had estimated he appeared on 1,500 recordings. And
Wow.
We have a hard time affirming that in a sense. But I'm not sure, I have over 200 albums that I've collected from his discography. And that, obviously, that's pretty impressive in itself. But I think he refers to pretty much every time there was a microphone. And he did the weekly radio show with Benny Goodman for a long, long time, and he was doing weekly radio shows with Jack Smith, and they were also recording on Capitol, backing Margaret Whiting and Kay Starr, and all the different singers, Billy Eckstein. So, and like I said, I've got a box full of tapes, and I'm sure he refers to those never made it to pressing. They never really made it to mastering, but they certainly were recording sessions that he did, and so I'm not really sure exactly how the 1,500 comes around, but
it depends how people count too. Sometimes I always wonder about these numbers because sometimes people are counting individual. Okay, I was on this track, right, or was I on this LP, right? So that's a difference of 1 or 10, So
yeah.
So who knows? But certainly, I mean, clearly, when I've seen on Discogs and elsewhere, it's a lot. Did he have music projects later on in the 70s and 80s?
Oh, sure. Yeah, well, the whole Jazz Chronicles, when they got the Sony Digital, they not only were trying to preserve their old archives that they had, but they were also continuing to record. And there's some great recordings that came out of those. The Jimmy Weibel Etudes album is just exquisite. There are a couple, and the John Bannister, he was a heck of a piano player, and nobody's ever heard of him.
Any other projects that he had around that time? Do you recall?
Not really. I mean, everything was, he'd just go hang out at Drum City, and they would record and do what they did down there. He was not playing a whole lot of gigs back in the 70s. Like I said, he did that final big tour, the Big Band Cavalcade. But he does a version of Big Noise for Winnetka. You can find that on YouTube. It's pretty cute. It's funny.
Well, is there anything, Vaughn, that when people think about, as you think about your dad and other people, jazz historians and others think about your dad, is there anything that is there a way that he's misunderstood, or something that you think that people should appreciate about him and his career? Well,
just the fact that he really didn't get the credit for the stuff that he did, they still, there are many historians that agree that the Laurendo Almeida Quartet was the precursor to the Bossa Nova. They may not call it actual Bossa Nova, but they definitely say it was.
It's this close.
Man, I'm telling you, And I've had.
It's just missing, a little bit of that syncopation, which the Brazilians themselves brought in later on.
Really, probably, yeah. John Goldsby, who's a very well-respected bassist, he wrote a book. The jazz bass book, and gave a chapter to Harry. And he really notates the bass line and really says, this is this is the basic structure for all bossa nova after this. So he's really devout as far as he believes that this was bossa nova.
Yeah, I meant more the drums, but I agree. Your dad's bass is seminal there, but I think the drumming is still, straight ahead jazz drumming.
Well,
right?
yeah,
So
that's Roy. I know, and it's interesting too. In Bud Shank's documentary, he says that it wasn't bossa nova because Roy played conga, and conga's Cuban. And I'm like, what are you talking about? They were doing something that had never been done before. They weren't trying to be traditional bossa nova or Brazilian. They weren't trying to do something traditional Brazilian. They were doing something completely new.
Yeah, how could they possibly be not measuring up to something that wouldn't be invented for 7 or 8 years?
Exactly.
Right.
Sure.
And only because they had made those records in the first place.
And and also, whenever you have a fusion of styles, you have to be in a place that has those styles that are really adequately represented. Now, at that time in Brazil, there was no real jazz in Brazil. You had the biorhythms, these old folk tunes that Lorendo was playing, but you didn't have that influx of real modern jazz. You did in LA. LA's like the great melting pot of everything. And so here you've got an Armenian-American bass player and a Brazilian guitar player and a New York Jew drummer and an Ohio, I think Bud was from Ohio, I'm not sure. Anyway, they all...
Yeah, you need someone from the heartland and all that.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. And so they were the legitimate representatives of those genres of music. When you didn't have that anywhere else. And that's why I'm staunch when I say that this is the place where it really came together.
Well, you have a convert here in me, because for me, bossa nova is, well, first of all, I love the music, but secondly, it's the most amazing cargo cult story, right? Where this, this record is made in LA by this Brazilian expat. It goes to Brazil, kind of by hook or by crook, becomes the seed for this blossoming of something else, which then gets rediscovered by Americans who are there because the CIA is sending them there on anti-communist PR missions, right? And they discover it and they bring it back, So it's got the most amazing DNA as music. But so many great musicians, including your father, had their fingerprints on it, and their DNA is all the way through the music, and that takes us to whatever, Mashkanada and Sergio Mendes and all that sort of stuff. But it comes through those channels, up the roots of that tree. It's amazing to me. And
that article that I sent you, The Real Story of the Bossa Nova, that came from a downbeat that was pretty much dedicated to Bossa Nova, the whole issue. And they had a record review section in the middle. And the only album in all of the Bossa Nova albums they reviewed that got a 5-star was the Harry Roy Lorendo Almeida Quartet. Not the second one that had Gary Peacock and Chuck Flores, because that gave a different feel. That was done 5 years later, in 1958. It was done as a album called Holiday in Brazil. It was originally released. And then when the Bossa Nova craze hit, Dick Bach re-released it as Brazilians Volume 2. Because all this...
But it's not the same.
Oh, it's the same album.
No, I know, but
it's not the same feel. No, of course not. No. I mean, people, a lot of times sports teams are the same way. You take someone out and you put another player in, that it's not going to be the same. Every player has their own unique personalities, no matter what you think. They do. And, it's just like Eddie, or what's David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar. They're just different styles, and whether they're successful or not, that remains to be seen. But definitely things change when you change players. And so
I'm Team Dave for what it counts.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, no, that's very well said, Vaughn. Look, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning
my pleasure,
taking time
Allan.
out of your weekend.
Sure.
And I have to say, it's to the extent that any way I can help to help continue to raise the profile of your dad, because I think he was a tremendous musician and so central to so much of what happened, not just as a musician, but also as an executive and an innovator and all the rest of it. It's a remarkable legacy that he's left, and I think I completely agree. I think we should shine more of a light on his contribution. And thank you for being so diligent in archiving and maintaining and keeping that torch alive.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here, Allan. I really do. I thank you very much for this.
Great. Okay, well, nice talking to you.
All right.
Take care.
You too.